We've had a great afternoon and great evening so far. With me, a panel that represents the best and the brightest in our politics. And India and Indians cannot get enough of politics, but I would argue that we should get more of the politicians who are here on this panel. Now, we are not discussing politics, we are not discussing potholes in Bengaluru, and we are not certainly taking pot shots at each other. The panel is slightly different and a tough one at that, but I will come to Rajeev first. As a teacher, as a professor, I want to ask you, in an India of 1.4 billion people and a very long civilizational history, an open society, and a foundation of belief that works on the system of, getting everyone along, what does data privacy mean in a world where the entire technology, the platforms are in the hands of foreigners who colonized us for hundreds of years? Explain that to the average Indian, sir.
Those foreign companies are run by Indians, actually. But the point is, I don't think it's a question of foreigners alone. It's also a question of what's in the hands of our own government. It's in the question of what's in the hands of our own companies as well. So the real issue is who owns that data? I own the data as a data principal, okay, if it is my data. And I want to make sure that that data is not misused. That's really what we're concerned about. And for that, we've been spending many years trying to come up with, in this case, a digital data protection, privacy protection bill. And the reason we need to do that is because in today's world, the risks really are across the board. And especially now that we are seeing technology advance the way it is advancing, we cannot even fathom where things are really going. So, for example, we just saw a picture of the wrestlers after their arrest with their faces sporting a smile. And this was a deep fake, right? So now what happens? They own their picture, the way they were looking, but someone has manipulated that with some other political intent. And obviously, they have every reason to be outraged. And not just them, every one of us should be outraged that this sort of a crime really is happening right in front of us, and people are getting away with it. So, really, it's not a question of modern East India companies. It's a question of each one of us, our rights to privacy, our rights to a variety of collateral rights that come with that, right to be forgotten, right to control and port the data that we have. All of those rights need to be enforceable. We need to have a legal framework that supports that. And we're still, that's all a work in progress. So I would, change the framing substantially.
Well, that's a good context to put for the conversation. And Tejasvi, I'll come to you because, while you were here as a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, there is a policy response which is in the hands of the government at the center. So allow me to go to Priyanka ji first. I just saw this article that you wrote about most recently about diversity and AI, but I'll come to that later. But I really want to bring that topic before our audience. Please tell me that why is it that our parliament can't seem to arrive at a consensus? And this is a bipartisan question. I'm not doing Congress, BJP here, or Shiv Sena for that matter. On such fundamental things as securing the data, if we are so focused, and all of you MPs are so focused on protecting the borders of the country, of our great nation, why is Parliament taking so much time? And not in this government. The first argument about data localization actually started in the Manmohan Singh government. Why is it not happening, ma'am?
I agree with you about the delay, and it is not just the parliament which is in a logjam right now. We are also seeing the select committee which is talking about it, discussing about it. There's dissent within that. While we all on this platform would agree, and I have also written to the IT minister earlier as well, that as far as the data is concerned, like you mentioned, the East India companies of today, we have to be very clear who owns this data. The personal data, of course, belongs to me, belongs to him, belongs to him. But the non-personal data belongs to my nation. And right now we are sitting on a data which is very rich, very diverse, and every company is looking at it to monetize it. So we need to have these processes in places. Unfortunately, we're seeing a personal data protection bill which is coming from the perspective of governments controlling the data. What we need to look at is a more neutral framework. Today, probably Bharatiya Janata Party is in power. Tomorrow, it could be another party in power. So how do we ensure that our people who have put their data and who are using, this data is being used, is not misused? That is where the concern comes, and I totally agree with you. This should have been passed much earlier than we still talking about it and still not presented in the parliament. We are talking about it coming in the parliament now, in the coming session. And let me also remind you that the earlier bill was withdrawn by the government and sent to a select committee because there were discrepancies. And discrepancies, I again go on to say, by using the national security angle, national safety angle, you are interfering in personal spaces. That is where you reach a gray zone, and that needs to be clarified. And I think we should look at it from a totally non-political perspective and from a perspective which matters to my nation more than it matters to my politics. That is how I would want to.
That's a good point. Tejasvi, as one of the youngest members of parliament, and what I would say also on the panel very obviously, you are a digital first native. You're part of the digital generation. Respond first to the point about the government wanting to be the big censor, wanting to influence public opinion and control the right of free speech. The point that was just made. Respond to that, please.
Well, Siddharth, the data protection law, whether it was the earlier version or whether it is the one that is in the works now, tries to harmoniously balance four important principles. One, and the paramount one being the right to privacy of the data principal, which the Supreme Court, in the Puttaswamy judgment, which arose, just to remind you, in the context of the UPA trying to curb citizens' fundamental rights. That was the way the judgment, originally came. Tries to keep that right, the citizens' right to privacy, as paramount. Also, make sure that it is harmoniously balanced with the interest of the security of the country in exceptional circumstances where the rights of a society, rights of a collective, will have to be given more importance than the right of an individual. The third important aspect that it also tries to address is to allow for space for innovation so that the new startups that are coming today are not burdened with regulatory compliance burdens. The fifth point being that the data protection law tries to make the principles India-centric and not, say, GDPR-centric or Australia or Singapore-centric. So these are the four primary principles around which the data protection law is being framed. And the opposition today may be trying to, cry hoarse that the government is trying to act all big daddy, etc. But I would only say that they must, at this juncture at least, wait for the bill, the final draft of the bill to be presented in the parliament. Because most of the suggestions which were made, including the ones that were made in the Joint Parliamentary Committee, which I was a part of.
Yes.
More than 2,000 representations and suggestions were made across the board by all stakeholders. Most of them have been positively considered. And the government has taken all of these concerns into account. And the draft bill that will be presented to Parliament, we are confident, will, to summarize again, give primacy to the individual, his right to privacy, allow for space for new startups and think tanks and data fiduciaries to process data lawfully, have an effective data Protection Board to enforce the rights that are enumerated,
Right.
specifically give out the rights and duties of the data principal and the data fiduciary, and also harmoniously balance all of these rights along with the very necessary interests of the national security of the nation.
All right. Rajeev Gowda, should we have censorship of hateful content, of content that misinforms, of content that can lead to cyberbullying, of content that leads to sexual abuse? What's your position on that?
Absolutely, yes. These are essentially crimes. And these are the new age crimes that have emerged. And the question is, who are the entities that are going to regulate this? Who are going to take action? What do you do when, for example, if you're talking about fake news and regulating misinformation, when some of the biggest purveyors of fake news are colleagues of my friend Tejasvi Surya, right? And I'm just...
At the very outset, he said this should not be a slugfest. I can take much deeper political...
Okay, that's fine. Let me rephrase that.
Keep it more academic.
Let me rephrase that. Thank you. My point is that a lot of misinformation emerges from government-related sources. And the basic point is, who will regulate them if it's not a neutral fact-checking entity? Okay? You've seen this happen enough times. You're fully aware of this. And so we do need to create regulatory setups that ensure that, whether it is, what did you say, sexual exploitation, whether it's cyberbullying, all of these, that there are ways of going after the perpetrators. That has to be in place. And like Priyanka mentioned earlier, today it's one, maybe you did, today it's one government, and tomorrow it's, another. So we should basically create a role for government, which is also, which also has its own constraints, so that you don't have excessive government roles.
Since you focus so much on the government, can I just interject? Which other country has been able to adopt what I would call, and I hope you don't mind it, a utopian model that you are proposing?
No, I mean, I suppose the closest would be Europe, which, tries to get closer to some of these things. But this is all work in progress. And there's nothing that comes in the way of...
Should we emulate Europe or
No.
come up
I
with
think we should go beyond.
Bharatiya solution?
What is a Bharatiya solution to tracking down someone who indulges in these sorts of crimes?
Okay.
We need solutions that work in our context, absolutely. And that is as Bharatiya...
If I may comment
come
this
in,
particular
and then
issue,
to
the
Tejas.
only reason I'm getting into
No,
this
please.
is I'll give you an example. When you talk about fake news, social media bullying, etc., digital platforms being misused, if you recall, there was this entire issue of bully by sully deals. I don't know how many of y'all are aware, but there was an intersectionality of women who are active on social media platforms, who belong to a particular religion, were being silenced. Let me also give you all a basic data. Women's representation on social media platforms is in single digit in India. That's one big, huge challenge that women are facing in terms of voicing their opinion. And those who are voicing their opinion, and if they belong to a particular community, a particular religion, they were being targeted. Their private photos were being used for a particular social media platform where they were being auctioned. जैसे बोली लगाते हैं ना, without the woman knowing. So that was a challenge they were facing. I remember approaching the IT minister then because it impacted me. It would impact any woman who's vocal and is seeing this kind of bullying. I wasn't part of that bullying. My face was not being used, but there were various women. And that's when the IT minister told me, and I would have no compunctions in saying that IT minister is open to suggestions, the IT minister we have now. But he said we do not have any law which can totally address this particular issue right now. We are willing to discuss this with you. I came up with best practices that are being used in various nations.
So Priyanka, taking the point that I asked Rajeev, and I genuinely mean this, much of what all of you say seems to be utopian because there is no regulatory architecture over an algorithm which is not in the control of any Indian.
Here's my point. I was just coming to the point. The point is that you all need to have a system in place which actually means that if you mess around with the law, when you have, criminal law in force, when you do some indulge in any criminal activity.
But how do you regulate transnational entities?
No,
I agree. Your example of the CRPC is Fantastic, fundamental.
And
But how do you...
we also see every bilateral agreements that we have. I think we need to insert this entire idea of bilateral cooperation. When you're talking about transnational, we need to insist on bilateral cooperation.
So if the
And I think
government
we
of the
should be
day,
waking up
if
to
the
this.
government of the day, Priyanka Chaturvedi, brings a foreign social media platform, sends a notice, then not you, but the opposition brings in politics into it. What does the government of the day do? Tomorrow you might be in government. What will you do in
No,
such a
unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is a very selective accountability coming from these foreign platforms. Let's have a neutral accountability from these platforms. I'm saying take away the safe harbor from them. If you're planning to take away the safe harbor, take it away. But please make
that's
it
a good
neutral.
point. That's a good point. And allow me to ask you this. The BJP government has a certain very radical views about indigenization across sectors. But when it comes to safe harbor, do you agree that the response has been slightly weak-kneed?
Well, if you look at the discussions that have happened both inside Parliament, outside of Parliament, in fact, I myself had spoken in Parliament once and twice, in fact, echoing the same sentiment that Priyanka ji said just now, of how these intermediaries which enjoy this exemption from liability, how they must be addressed. However, this is not a problem that just India is grappling with. Like you very rightly said, this is an evolving space where tech and law are playing catch up. Therefore, there needs to be more deliberation, and that's what is happening in the country as we speak. But what I can tell you is...
How long? I will apologize, just for how long?
but-
Because I get the sense this is going
I'm
the way
telling
of
you-
crypto regulation.
No,
Tejasvi
correct, but
Surya.
this cannot, it can also not be a very knee-jerk reaction. The government, like I told you, has deliberated extensively. The new bill which will address most of these concerns is going to be presented in the parliament very shortly. But again, coming back to the issue of, hate speech and crimes that are already mandated as crimes under the CRPC, IPC, etc. And also how to make these platforms which are transnational neutral. I think we really need to deliberate on how we can have some kind of a algorithm audit. Because most of these platforms, when we say write to them, to their grievous redressal agencies, they always blame on the algorithm. But the algorithm also has its bias, because the algorithm is also written by certain, people, engineers and others who have a certain ideological bias. So I think, we will progressively move towards having algorithm auditing and such other things that is necessary. Not just I'm speaking in the Indian context, but globally. But, the problem in India, Siddharth, is that when I tell you that, a particular institution is going to be put in place, and if a certain order or a certain outcome comes which is not in favor of the opposition, then the opposition immediately starts questioning the very credibility of the institution. If you win elections, election commission is good, but if you do not lose elections, the election commission
Well,
is
at
not
least
good.
since we are in Karnataka, no one questioned
So no one
EVM
questioned the
this
EVM
time
or the
around.
election commission. So that's exactly what I'm telling. So tomorrow, even if you will have the data protection board in place, and say somebody from the Congress or the Shiv Sena goes to the data protection board and they get a result that's not in their liking, then they may start questioning every single thing.
I have a couple of things to say. Firstly, about the guidelines. The guidelines are decided by, it should be decided on the basis of geography and on basis of diversity. It cannot be decided by those who are sitting in the US, who are the CEOs, even if they are Indian CEOs, sitting in the US and deciding what the guidelines for India should be first. Second, about they not agreeing, political parties not agreeing, let me tell you, they are proposing a national regulatory framework. We are insisting on state regulatory framework, because every state is very diverse. So you're talking about, we are sitting in Karnataka today, you're talking about Karnataka-related specific stuff. I may have an issue, because I'm Shiv Sena, I come from Maharashtra, I have a very Maharashtra-specific outlook. So I may think the national body may not understand what prevails in my state. So those are the differences which need to be ironed out. And let me just say one thing. Of course, it's an evolving process, but we need to have a broader framework under which we all work. If we continue to keep pushing this bill, and not coming out with something which is fluid in content, which can be changed as per the changing technology, then we are not reaching anywhere. And diversity, when we talk, when I spoke about geographical spaces, diversity I also mean about gender, which I've written about. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to speak about it.
Rajeev Gowda,
Just
yeah,
30-second point. It's a good thing that Priyanka ji mentioned about it being flexible, which is why a lot of the principles that are enunciated in the bill is not cast in stone, and quite a lot of things that are important and should be flexible is left to subordinate legislation. But unfortunately, opposition makes it a political issue again, saying that so much is left to subordinate legislation. So I think these are issues which, like how we started off in the very beginning, that this is an evolving space, this is a matter of national security. There must be more consensus across the board.
And
that's the consensus that we are striving to achieve.
There is no global model. And Rajeev Gowda, the very quick point, but before that, I think we also need to recognize that other countries, monochromatic countries, at best 80% one religion, 20% of minorities, two colors, one language, and compare that with the complexity and diversity of India, you realize that our policy planners at whatever place they are sitting and across the board, across parties, have a huge challenge. It's not an easy task. Rajeev got a final point, which I'll come quickly across the panel. Should there be large financial deterrents to achieve compliance and perhaps also reduce these fears of the government being a big brother? Is that the way to go, Rajeev Gowda?
Well, the kinds of companies that we're talking about probably will be deterred or will come into line only if there are large fines that they have to face. What will this do to the startups? What will this do to other companies that are not so deep-pocketed? You can't have one fine on the basis of how wealthy one organization is when the crime is the same. So those are some of the challenges that are out there. But these are all part of the issues that we need to work with.
No, yeah. Tejasvi, you want to come in on that? And let me just also butt in that some years back, the government of India enacted a very far-reaching legislation in the UPA times, and one of the worst things about that was the financial deterrents. So there is a genuine fear about the government putting such financial burdens on small companies, because the first thing that a Sarkari Babu can do, fine laga do, band kara do. Tejasvi.
Well, as so far as the data protection bill is concerned, the approach is to not criminalize a penal action or non-compliance or any, so rather to take the route of financial burdens or, placing financial penalties. And the point that Rajeev ji made, it also has been kind of addressed even in the present edition of the bill by looking at, say, startups in a different scale and looking at significant data fiduciaries, which are, say, large data processing entities in a different manner altogether. So I think insofar as the startups are concerned, there's a light touch regulation, there's a lot of sandboxing allowed for them. But insofar as the big data processors are concerned, significant data fiduciaries are concerned, there's a different burden of degree of burden that's placed on them. So let's see how.
No, but if they indulge in the same crimes, then you have an issue, no?
That's a different.
No, I just
we probably needed another half hour for this, but Priyanka, the final word.
Differently, while
when
those
you talk
significant ones
about
are
financial penalties, let me give you an example of not being a penalty but being taxed to death. Is the crypto industry. And I'm not talking about crypto trade exchanges. Okay. You have killed innovation. You have got unicorns to flip out of this country. You're taking pride in over 120 unicorns. Most of them have flipped and they've headquartered somewhere else.
I thought you were about to talk about the
also ensured
credit card tax on international transactions.
That also I've spoken about. If you had given me the time, I could have told you that also. But this is what I'm speaking about: financial burdening and penalizing them. I think that's a terrible idea. Anyone who wants to work in India needs a broad framework, and if you give them that framework, they'd be happy to come to India and work with you. On
a completely tangential note, how many of you oppose the tax that has been put on international transactions, despite the clarification of 7.5 lakh? Okay, maybe that has to also do with the fact that the credit card base in India is not that much, but Rajeev Gowda? Well, we conducted this debate in English, but I know that at least 5 different languages could have been used right here in this panel. That's an example of the diversity of the country. And the challenges of trying to provide data privacy. There are multiple other subjects. We didn't mean to just focus on one law, but that's the spearhead of the move to safeguard and provide data security in a digital Bharat. Rajeev Gowda, Tejasvi Surya, Priyanka Chaturvedi, thank you very much for your time.